Hello, and welcome to Explaining Brazil, a new podcast brought to you by the Brazilian Report in partnership with HuffPost Brazil. My name is Kira Long, and I'm a contributing writer at the Brazilian Report. In this space, we'll talk about Brazilian politics, economics, and social issues. So far, we've discussed the federal intervention in Rio de Janeiro and re-election possibilities for Brazil's current president, Michel Temer. Today, we'll be looking at Brazil's economic recovery, but without Diego Errejeta, editor-in-chief at HuffPost Brazil. So this week, I'll be talking to Gustavo Ribeiro, the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report.
Hello, Chiara. It's great having you back to our podcast. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Great, thank you.
So, last week, the OECD published a report detailing its projections for Brazil's economic outlook. The government's been telling anyone who'll listen that Brazil left its long recession and returned to growth in June of last year. But growth isn't quite reaching economists' expectations yet. So we wanted to ask, how solid is Brazil's economic recovery?
Yeah, like you said, we had a positive GDP result after 3 years of very bad results. But it was only 1%, which is already something when you compare to 2015 and 16, when the GDP shrank by 3.5% in each year. But while a lot of indicators show that Brazil has emerged from one of its worst recessions ever, people on the streets don't feel like the recession is over. And that's because unemployment rates remain very high, salary bumps are very little, and there's still a lack of confidence by everyday Brazilians. Brazilians don't feel like they can go shopping again and everything is going to be fine. A lot of opinion polls shows that for most Brazilians, the crisis is still going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are still definitely feeling the effect. If we skip forward to now, Brazil's GDP is still projected to grow by about 3% over the course of this year, over the course of 2018. But it fell short last year of its targets. Factors that it influenced this.
No, and
kind of detailed in the OECD report, which we'll get into in a minute. There's been a horizontal and steady growth across most sectors. The labor reforms are supposed to have helped, but there are still some big underlying structural problems that seem to be getting in the way of Brazil's return to solid growth.
Yes, you mentioned the labor reform, which was advertised as a way to stimulate hiring from companies and to lower unemployment rates, which from that perspective, the reform is an utter failure, because what it has led to is the precarization of labor. We have a lot of informal workers, and the number of, for instance, self-employed persons went up by 4%. Actually, this economic recovery is more like a great result for the agribusiness sector, which grew by 13%. But like you said, most sectors of the economy flatlined in 2017. It's not
right, because I mean, Brazil's exit from recession was largely credited to the agribusiness sector in general. They had a bumper harvest last year, right?
Exactly. And that super harvest is already having some side effects, because coffee prices went down due to an excess of offer. And what is problematic about Brazil, and what makes us think that this might not be as sustainable of a recovery as we wanted to, is that Brazilians' investment ratings are at its lowest point since 1999, only 15% of the GDP. And if you don't invest, it's very difficult to grow, especially coming from such a precarious position as Brazil has.
Right, and also if you look at how international markets are looking at Brazil, I think Brazil got downgraded by both Fitch and S&P quite recently, didn't it?
Yes. Yes, we have been pushed further into junk territory. And, well, like we said, agribusiness has been the engine of Brazilian economy. And this week, the week started with very bad news for the agribusiness sector. There was a new phase of Operation Weak Flash, which is an operation investigating how meat companies have bribed sanitary inspectors to essentially sell rotten meat. Last year was the first phase, and roughly 20 countries suspended or limited imports from Brazilian pork, poultry, and beef. And now it's strike two this year. On Monday, the federal police raided BRF, which is Brazil's second largest meat producer. And the whole sector, over the course of one day, lost 6.3 billion reais, which is almost $2 billion in one day.
Yeah, it was quite a revelation. I think a lot of people were quite surprised if the stock market's anything to judge by. The former CEO, Pedro Faria, was also arrested, wasn't he? As was former Deputy CEO, Elias Rubens Santos.
Yes, exactly. And it's not the first time that Brazil is one of the top meat producers in the world, but it's not the first time that we are accused of selling rotten meat. Last year, the European Commission threatened to suspend all imports of meat products from Brazil, whether it's poultry, pork, or beef. And now we're just giving an excellent opportunity for competitors to lobby for restrictions against Brazilian products and to increase their market share.
No, absolutely. I'm a little concerned that we might get some of the same things that we saw less than a year ago with the last phase of this operation, which was, you had these shipments of meat that had already left the port, kind of just stopped in the sea around the ports because countries didn't want to import the things that they were buying because of the risk of contamination.
Yeah, and even in Brazil, there could be a bump in consumption, because I remember last year after the scandal, you went to supermarkets and people were not that eager to go to the meat section.
But I mean, this operation isn't the only thing recently within the last week that could have a serious impact on Brazil's economic outlook. There's also Trump's announcement on the steel tariffs that I think could have a really big impact. Didn't he say that he wants to introduce tariffs for up to 10% on aluminium and 25% on steel goods? I mean, that doesn't sound like it's particularly good for Brazil.
Yes, Brazil is the second second country exporting steel goods to the U.S., just trailing behind Canada. And last year we exported like $8 billion, and 1/3 of everything we export in terms of steel goods go to the U.S. So anything that might restrict that or impair the competitiveness of Brazilian companies, it's no wonder that the Brazil's government expressed, quote unquote, deep concerns about this Trump decision.
I mean, I think Temer is also going to try and negotiate with the U.S. government, which doesn't necessarily fill me with hope given his track record with diplomacy.
Yeah, exactly. I remember when Temer went to Norway last year, and he was greeted by...
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Exactly, the deputy director of the airport. Not even a member of the cabinet or anything.
No. So there are a lot of other reasons that Brazil's economic recovery, even outside of those two things that have just happened in the last week, there are a lot of other reasons that Brazil's recovery might not be as smooth as we think. or as analysts are hoping. I know that unemployment is still fairly high. I think there's just more than 12.7 million people who are currently unemployed, and like you said, there's a lot of informal employment as well. But this leaves a significant hole, I think. And I think you also reported recently about how there will be some differences in how each state recovers economically, and how this supposed recovery might not necessarily be as broad and as sweeping as one might hope.
Yeah. In Brazil, poorer states are getting left behind and far behind, and states of the South and Southeast, which have better infrastructure, a better, higher GDP per capita, those states are getting their stuff together, and it's a bit. We reported in January about how poor Brazilians are still not feeling the economic recovery, and I have some data here. For instance, among poor Brazilians, only 6% believe that inflation rates have decreased, which they have. So it shows that purchasing power has gone way down, because if the inflation is down and you still believe the prices are going up, it's because you've lost your purchasing power. And 53% say that money is tighter. Only 49% think they cannot save money right now because they don't have money to save. And a lot of the main worries in Brazilians' minds is, I don't have money for my monthly expenses, and I will lose my job eventually. So we talk a lot about how people living from paycheck to paycheck live, how hard it is. But there are a lot of people who are not even in that category of paycheck to paycheck. Their paycheck is not enough for their monthly expenses, actually.
I mean, I've done some reporting on Bolsa Familia, on the kind of lowest income families, and that was certainly true of them. But I think that what a lot of people maybe don't realize is that, exactly as you said, that sort of precarity is much more widespread than you might imagine, and it's not necessarily changing despite kind of the rhetoric of the current government and of the finance minister, Henrique Meirelles in particular, saying we are recovering and this is all great. Like you said in the podcast last week about what he promotes on his Facebook page, for example, all the positive news about Brazil's economy, and just kind of ignoring anything that doesn't fit with that narrative.
Yes, and the problem is, if São Paulo is recovering, it doesn't mean that Brazil as a whole is recovering. São Paulo is the heart of the industry, is where the Brazilian GDP essentially is, but we have 26 other states, and things are rough in a lot of states. There's no money for public investments. We have seen the case in Rio, but there's always a lot of other states who are struggle to provide basic services. And public investment in Brazil as a whole, 15% of the 15% of the GDP, and it's not nearly enough, especially for a country like Brazil. And I think one of the problems for the Brazilian economy as well is that, and OECD talked about it, is how isolated we are from the global economy, how we have suffered the bad consequences of globalization, but we have not profited anything because of the way that we isolate ourselves and we create barriers. And it's not a protectionism with a clear goal, because protectionism is not bad in itself, as long as you have a project of modernizing your industry, of giving your industry time to get competitive. And I actually don't see here in Brazil. I think a lot of companies just profit from barriers to make an extra buck, but not to modernize themselves.
Yeah, and the distortion is such here that it means that certain costs are much, much higher for a lot of Brazilians as a direct result of that. Things like basic phone call costs, I think, are 8 times higher in Brazil than they are in the U.S.
Yeah, speaking of phone, do you remember a few years ago it was less expensive to get a plane ticket, go to Miami, buy an iPhone, sleep one night, and come back than to buy an iPhone here in Brazil?
I have definitely read things to that extent and heard things about that as well. There is some speculation that the recent rises in plastic surgeries being done in Brazil are actually the same social class, but they can no longer afford to go to Miami to do it.
Yeah. And like you said, the government needs to push through a narrative that everything is getting better or everything is fine right now. And more or less, when you open the newspaper here in Brazil, you see that narrative dominating the coverage. But in your opinion, is it just a presidential bid by Henrique Meirelles? Is it just to make him viable for the October presidential election, or is there something else in it?
Well, I think he's certainly toying with the idea. He's currently polling at 1%, I think, which is not particularly high, although it's not that much lower than most of the other candidates at this point in time. He would have to resign by the 1st of April this year if he decided to run. I honestly don't know if he's genuinely thinking about it, but I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of decided at the last minute or managed to strike a deal with or a partnership with somebody else at the last minute. What do you think?
I think he really wants to run for president, but I don't believe that it will be easy for him to get a party to go on board, because right now it seems to me nearly impossible for him, because for him to get to 4%, he would have to multiply by 4 the amount of voting intention he has. I don't see him as a viable candidate. I see him as a potentially very good vice presidential candidate for someone who wants to sell an image of being at the center of the political spectrum, and Henrique Meirelles is the market's darling. So having him in your ticket might be a good option for guys like São Paulo Governor Geraldo Alckmin, who is a center-right guy. To have him paired with a guy like Meirelles makes sense, maybe for both, but I don't know if Meirelles' ego will allow him to take the back seat in a presidential ballot.
Yeah, I mean, Meirelles' focus on kind of making austerity economics work for Brazil certainly gives him the air of the reputation of the sort of person who could maybe push for the pension reform post-elections. Pension reform is something that the OECD said in its report is absolutely fundamental for Brazil to return to economic growth. I think it said that Brazil's GDP, approximately 35% of Brazil's GDP goes towards social spending, but that's largely tied up with pensions. And if that doesn't change, then Brazil can't kind of rejig that to focus more on things like Bolsa Familia that will reduce inequality.
Yes, but I don't know, because Bolsa Familia is like 1 or 2% of the GDP, and I believe it's more like a way to scare people and say, well, we need to pass this pension reform, otherwise Bolsa Familia is threatened. Because when you look closer, Temer's administration, which was all about austerity and reducing public spending, he didn't do that much. Remember, last year he had to fight 2 indictment requests, and the amount of money that the government spent on projects sponsored by congressmen in order to secure their votes to reject the indictment requests against Temer. So there's a lot of trimming down that needs to be done in the federal government, and I don't think that it was done, not to the extent that this administration talks about.
Interesting. So you think this adamant focus on pension reforms is maybe not as big a deal as the government would like to portray it as, and as kind of institutions like the OECD would like to see it as?
No, I think it is a big deal. The problem is I don't think that the pension reform proposed by the government and will strike down privileges, because the problem with the pension reform in Brazil right now is that it treats people in a very unequal way. If depending on your career, depending on the amount of time you worked, you have very different kinds of benefits and rights. And the problem with the way that the government is trying to pass it is that it still preserves a caste of public servants, federal public servants, of some careers, including judges and prosecutors, careers that politicians hate to upset. But we still get a lot of privileged castes, and the government itself says if we approve our pension reform in 5-10 years, we're going to have to approve a new one. And the problem for me is that it's not that there's too much austerity, but there's not enough austerity, that it's very selective. People with less money are being more punished. That's my thought. And I think that threatening to end Bolsa Familia unless you do something is more of a terrorist tactic to get your point across.
Well, I think we might have to discuss that whole argument on another podcast, because I think we're out of time for today. Thank you to all of our listeners this week. We're really glad that you joined us. If you liked what you heard, please take a few minutes to check out our reporting at the Brazilian Report. You can find new pieces on Brazilian politics, economics, and society every day on our site. That's Brazilian.report.
We'd love to hear your thoughts about this podcast. Please get in touch and let us know what you think or your suggestions for what else you'd like to hear from us. You can reach us via the Brazilian Report's website or Twitter. Our handle is Brazilian_rep. At Brazilian_rep.
This podcast was written and produced by me, Kira Long, for the Brazilian Report. That's all for now. We'll see you next week.